In this third section, I want to talk about cultures as lineages of so-called reality. I want to start with a kind of little example. I've composed this image to think about different concepts that might be possible, that would be possible for us to talk about. Let's say that these are different emotions. That's a good example to start with. All kinds of possible emotions. Some of them are more extreme and therefore more obvious and maybe more relevant to take into account. And there might be more usual ones, but we take them for granted. It's the extreme ones that draw our attention because we have to respond appropriately. So given those extreme ones, we might find that we start responding to people with anything near to that extreme as if it were that extreme. And we create a circularity by our response to them so that they have no option but to respond in the appropriate way for that which we have named. So we get into this thing where many emotions that aren't extreme are just completely forgotten. We might talk about it as tranquil or comfortable, but it's not taken seriously. And these ones then get labeled as the emotions that we have. The interesting thing is, this gets done differently, very differently in different cultures. So what gets grouped together and which are the fundamental extremes are different in different lineages of different cultures. And so it is not only with emotions, but with any kinds of concepts. So cultures are coherent networks of conversation that end up conserving one or more dimensions of continuity for that culture. What this means, in a way, is that the distinctions that are accepted in a culture influence how people see and how they act, which determines the sort of cultural world, the world around them, the Anthropocene that arises with them, which validates the distinctions, and therefore those distinctions continue to be accepted in a culture. It's a way of confirming the culture as the reality it considers itself to be. So we have been talking about these operations of discovery that lead to an ultimate truth, the reality. That was based on the question, how do I do what I do as I operate as an observer? If I'm going to explore that question more deeply, I need to momentarily at least talk about what do I mean as an observer. So what is an observer? Well, the observer also arises as a further recursion in language. It is when we do distinguish our distinguishing. We actually notice that we are doing this distinguishing and observing the process of distinguishing. This is fundamentally observing. Under that, we have a lot of prior coordinations, but those all disappear, and we end up with observer and observing flattened also to named objects, whereas it really was grounded in distinguishing. If we accept that observer and observer take place in the praxis of living and language, we have a very interesting beginning point. We don't accept it is when you come to these operations of discovery, reality, and a place where there's objectivity and what's not objective is subjective. If we do accept it, we realize that we are creating lineage of distinctions, which in turn generate coherent domains of explanations. That is, many realities, or we could talk about it, Maturana does, as objectivity in parentheses, because, well, the way I see it, we're still creating objects because we are creating distinctions in language and therefore live in a world in which objects appear for us in all purposes. And one of these, let's say the green one, is the one that explains that observer and observer takes place in living and language, but that doesn't really mean that it's the best way. However, It is a constitutive ontology. We realize that we constitute our worlds, which is different from the reality one of absolutist or essentialist ontology. However, I'd like to point out that although it's nice to draw that way, that absolutist ontology is just one of the many realities, and there are many, many forms of them. And there are probably multiple forms of constitutive ontologies. I happen to adhere to this one that is grounded in the praxis of living in language. And I have to caution us that no look is ever whole. We can never get the final view of everything, as this other artwork by Nita Harrison, The Eye of God, implies. I love artists and how they are able to communicate concepts that are sometimes hard to say in words. So cultures evolve, systems of workable enabling constraints, just as this reflection from a plate ends up providing us with a real-looking image of the world, with the light in a particular way. And these workable enabling constraints, we, in due course, take for granted and don't even realize that they were generated by us. So what are we to do? So what? And you'll see I've now used an image of a field instead of a natural world images, because this is what our duties is as a human beings. I mentioned earlier that we have systemic cognition and the distinctions in language as a recursive thing. Each influences the other. And I think this is a dynamic that conserves ambiguity. We are able to retain that same sense that there is something more besides that which we have actually named. Then a culture on top of that will create a reality around the distinctions of language. And this is a different dynamic. This is a dynamic that conserves certainty. So how do we get out of it? I think one of the main things is a sense of wonder, a sense of wonderment and wondering, both of it, which restores an acceptance of ambiguity, even as we live in a culture that we treat as reality for most of the operations that we do in our daily lives. There's a graph that I'm thinking about, and I'm not sure it's very valid. It needs some further thinking. We think about our awareness of complexity over time, probably more developmental than evolutionary, but it may be evolutionary too. So we pay attention to complexity as we grow. And then our acceptance of ambiguity. It's very high when we're infants and very, very young children, because we don't have much sense of complexity, and much of the world is uncertain for us. But as we grow, and I don't know what age this happens with, we come to the sense that our ambiguity more or less matches our sense of complexity. And in this whole age, a sense of wonder has maintained our difference. But then we come to a loss of ambiguity, is we become sure of things. Then we are in a position that when we confront something that's very complex and we don't have an acceptance of ambiguity, we deny it, or if we feel stressed. This is where I think it is worthwhile for us to recapture that sense of wonder. We had it innocently when we were young, and maybe early in our evolution. At this stage, we must come back to it through a sense of wisdom. So how do we move from innocent to wise? I have talked elsewhere about Homo sapiens, amans, as being our grounding in human evolution. That was also Maturana's work. And he proposed that we actually need to be Homo sapiens, amans sapiens now. In other words, we can't get to wisdom through only being loving. We have to be wise and loving. So a new subspecies of us as we act in this way. So what do I think? Wisdom depends on an interplay between systemic understanding and logical action. This is the Homo sapiens bit. And we have to do this and care for the other without prejudice or demand. And this is the amans sapiens part, especially the amans part, because in love we accept the other as legitimate, or as it appears, as well as we can see, without trying to impose anything of our own on it. So, to act in wisdom, we must dance with ambiguity. And that's really all I have to say. These ideas need further thinking, and thank you, and good dancing to you, to dance with your own sense of ambiguity. And this was, of course, American Society for Cybernetics Day, and I welcome further conversation, which was possible in the conference, but is also possible as follow-up. Thank you.